I woke up that Friday morning with the premonition that something was amiss, though I couldn't quite place it until I felt the cold absence beside me. I rolled over, expecting to be greeted by the familiar warmth of her body, the gentle rhythm of her breathing, the soft, even rise and fall that had always promised comfort and security. Instead, the bed was a barren landscape of cold sheets, empty and unforgiving. In that moment, my heart began to pound with an inexplicable anxiety, and I sat up slowly, every muscle in my body tensing as I tried to make sense of the silence. The house was too quiet, a void where once there had been a symphony of morning sounds. Her soft hum as she stirred in the kitchen, the clink of a coffee cup, the occasional murmur of affectionate words whispered between us. It was all gone, replaced by an eerie calm that foretold a disruption I had been trying to ignore. I rose from the bed, my mind racing as I navigated through the empty apartment. The bathroom was as deserted as the bed, the usual reminders of her presence absent, the neatly arranged towels, the faint trace of her favorite perfume lingering in the air. I moved on to the kitchen, half expecting to see a teacup or a lipstick mark on the counter, but found nothing that could anchor me back to reality. It was then that my eyes caught sight of a stark piece of paper taped to the refrigerator, its presence both intrusive and haunting. I reached out with trembling fingers and peeled it off slowly, as if the act of removing it might somehow undo the irreversible. The note read simply, "Goodbye. Never loved you anyway." For a few agonizing seconds, I stood there, frozen, the weight of those words sinking into the recesses of my mind and heart. Shock and disbelief warred within me, emotions colliding in a chaotic maelstrom that left me numb yet hyper-aware of every detail in the room. I should have been devastated, I told myself, the very thought of the life we had built together crumbling under the weight of betrayal. I should have been angry, incensed by the cruelty of her departure and the casual dismissal of years we had shared. And yet, as the minutes ticked by, an unfamiliar sensation began to stir within me, a deep-seated suspicion that hinted at truths I had been too reluctant to confront. I recalled the subtle signs that had begun to manifest 3 months earlier, the tiny fissures that had gradually widened into gaping chasms in the foundation of our marriage. At first, they were barely noticeable, a slight change in tone, a secretive glance at a phone, the manner in which she became curiously interested in aspects of our finances that had always been my domain. I had tried to brush these signs off as mere anomalies, the kind of trivial misunderstandings that every long-term relationship endures. But as the days turned into weeks, the cracks had multiplied and deepened, hinting at a truth that was both painful and inevitable. I had been aware, however reluctantly, that the woman I had married was slowly evolving into someone else, a stranger cloaked in familiar features. Now, standing in the midst of the quiet devastation of an empty home and a note that shattered the facade of our perfect life, I felt an odd sense of clarity. The initial sting of loss was quickly being replaced by a calculated determination to understand the betrayal. I couldn't help but think that perhaps I had been preparing for this moment all along. Every late-night phone call, every unexplained disappearance of funds, every cryptic message on her locked phone now aligned into a disturbing pattern. It was as if I had been given a glimpse into a darker truth, a truth that had been hidden behind the mask of our shared life. With each recollection, the seed of suspicion took deeper root, urging me to retrace every step, every conversation, every moment that I had dismissed as ordinary. I moved from room to room, piecing together the silent narrative left behind, a trail of evidence that was as cold and unyielding as the sheets on our bed. Each piece of the puzzle only confirmed what I had long suspected, that she had not only fallen out of love, but had been living a life that was as duplicitous as it was secret. The emptiness of the space around me was a cruel mirror reflecting my own unpreparedness for the betrayal that lay ahead. In that quiet, suffocating silence, a plan began to form, one that would transform my sorrow into a calculated pursuit of truth and justice. I realized that in the midst of my personal heartbreak, I had an opportunity to expose not just the fracture in our relationship, but the broader scheme that she had been orchestrating. The initial shock, which might have easily overwhelmed me, was now being channeled into a determination to uncover every lie, every deception that had led to this final act of abandonment. I had seen the cracks before, and now I understood that I had been given a chance to confront the reality of her double life. A life of calculated manipulation and secret transactions that had remained hidden under layers of charm and feigned vulnerability. As I stared at that note one last time, its words burned into my memory, I made a silent promise to myself. I would not let this betrayal define me, nor would I let her deception go unpunished. In the quiet aftermath of our shared life, I resolved to become the detective of my own story, to follow the breadcrumbs she had left behind, and to transform the emptiness of that bed into a launching pad for my quest for truth and retribution. I stepped away from the refrigerator, the note still clutched in my hand, feeling a mixture of sorrow and grim determination. The silence of the apartment was no longer an echo of what had been lost, but a call to arms, a challenge to unravel the tangled web of deceit that had led to this fateful morning. And as I began to piece together the fragments of our shattered life, I knew that nothing would ever be the same again. This was not the end. It was merely the beginning of a journey into the depths of betrayal, where every revelation would lead me closer to understanding the true nature of the woman I thought I had known, and to reclaiming the dignity and justice that I had been so cruelly denied. I walked to the window and stared out at the awakening city, its skyline bathed in the soft glow of dawn, unaware of the drama unfolding within my walls. In that moment, I realized that I was no longer a passive victim of fate, but an active participant in a story that I would write on my own terms. The emptiness of the bed, the silence of the room, and the harsh truth on that note were no longer symbols of defeat. They were the first clues in a mystery that I was now determined to solve, a mystery that would reveal not only the dark secrets of my wife's past, but also the strength I never knew I possessed. I set the note aside with deliberate care, as if laying down a gauntlet for the inevitable confrontation that lay ahead, and resolved that by the end of this journey, I would not only understand the depths of her betrayal, but would also ensure that no one else would ever be deceived by the woman I once loved. I sat down at my desk, the early light illuminating scattered papers and memories of a happier time, when the warmth of her smile filled our home with hope. Now, every shadow seemed to whisper a question. What had I missed, and what lay hidden beneath the surface of our shared life? I took a deep breath, steadying my resolve, and began to map out the path I would follow, a path that would lead me through a labyrinth of lies and half-truths. Each step forward was a promise to myself that I would not be defeated by sorrow or blinded by anger. I would be vigilant, methodical, and, above all, relentless in my pursuit of the truth. I remember everything as if it were etched into my very soul, the moments that now seemed like distant echoes of a life I no longer recognized. And as I sat there, the first light of dawn creeping steadily across the room, I made the silent vow to transform this heartbreak into a mission. The betrayal that had begun in that empty bed would not be the end of my story, but the catalyst for a journey that would redefine who I was. With that, I turned from the window, ready to face the day and the mysteries it held, knowing that every moment from here on out was a step toward reclaiming not only my identity, but also the truth that had been so long hidden in the shadows. I took one last look around the silent apartment, the ghost of her presence lingering in every corner, and stepped out into the day with a heart hardened by resolve. This was the beginning of a new chapter in my life, a chapter written in betrayal, pain, and ultimately redemption. I now move forward into the days ahead, each moment a piece of a puzzle that, once solved, would reveal the true extent of her deception. I know the path will be treacherous, filled with painful memories and revelations, yet I am prepared to face it head-on. With every breath, I am more determined to reclaim what was lost, to expose the lies that had been carefully hidden behind her charm, and to ensure that justice, in whatever form it may come, is served. I now continue the journey, piecing together the fragmented signs that had, in retrospect, signaled the slow unraveling of our shared life. I remember distinctly how, over time, subtle hints began to whisper a warning that I had initially chosen to ignore. In the ensuing days, as I sifted through the remnants of what once was a life of trust and mutual understanding, I found solace in knowing that my instincts, though pained, were not entirely misguided. Each silent moment in that empty apartment became a call to action, a call to meticulously retrace the events that led to this fateful morning. And so, with the quiet determination of a man who has lost everything yet refuses to be defeated, I prepared myself for the storm of truths that lay ahead, knowing that even in betrayal, there is a strange clarity that illuminates the path forward. I remember the first time I truly believed in the woman I married, the vibrant, captivating Sarah who had swept into my life with a smile that promised endless possibilities. We met 6 years ago at a charity gala, an elegant affair where the clink of glasses and the hum of polite conversation set the stage for what I now realize was the beginning of a complex masquerade. I still recall the way she carried herself that night, confident yet approachable, her laughter filling the room and drawing me in like a moth to a flame. In those early moments, nothing seemed out of the ordinary. In fact, she embodied everything I had ever dreamed of in a partner. Intelligent, compassionate, and seemingly genuine. I was completely taken by her charm and the ease with which she navigated every social interaction, leaving me awestruck and, if I'm honest, a bit enamored by the mystery she so effortlessly exuded. But as our life together unfolded, I started to notice subtle discrepancies between the woman I thought I knew and the stranger who was gradually emerging before my eyes. At first, it was just small things, a reluctance to share details about her past, a peculiar habit of steering conversations away from topics that once would have sparked her enthusiasm. I remember asking her about her childhood, expecting her eyes to light up with fond memories, only to be met with a guarded expression and a vague response that made me wonder if there was more she wasn't telling me. Over time, her reluctance wasn't limited to her early years. It extended to her relationships, her career accomplishments, and even her financial background. It was as if she had carefully curated a version of herself that was designed to captivate and charm, while concealing the parts that might have disrupted the idyllic narrative I had constructed in my mind. You might wonder how I could be so blind, so utterly smitten by someone who was slowly becoming a stranger. In those days, I was lulled into a sense of security by the very illusion she projected. A seamless blend of beauty and intellect, always dressed impeccably for every occasion, never allowing any crack to form in the facade of perfection. Yet as time wore on, her actions began to speak louder than her carefully chosen words. I noticed that she avoided introducing me to old friends, or if she did, their interactions were brief and awkward, as if there was an unspoken agreement to keep certain parts of her life hidden. When we discussed finances, a topic that should have been transparent between two people building a life together, she deftly sidestepped any in-depth conversation, often redirecting the discussion back to matters concerning my money. It was a peculiar inversion of roles, one that left me increasingly uneasy and questioning whether I had, in fact, married the person I thought I had. In quiet moments of introspection, I would replay our conversations in my mind, analyzing every detail with the precision of a detective slowly piecing together clues. There was a time when her stories about past work experiences would subtly contradict themselves, the timeline of her career shifting with each retelling. I began to notice that her accounts of her life before our marriage were filled with gaps, important events that were glossed over or entirely omitted, as if she were editing her history for my benefit. These omissions, initially dismissed as mere quirks of a private person, eventually coalesced into a pattern that was too consistent to ignore. It was as though the woman I had fallen for was compartmentalizing her life, leaving entire chapters out of our shared story. This realization hit me hard, a cold reminder that the person I had trusted with my heart was not, in fact, the person I had believed her to be. As our relationship advanced, the transformation became more pronounced. I found myself questioning the authenticity of her emotions, wondering if the warmth and passion I once cherished were nothing more than well-rehearsed performances designed to mask a deeper agenda. There were evenings when, as we sat together in silence after a long day, I would catch a fleeting look in her eyes, a momentary flash of fear or guilt that vanished before I could truly understand it. Those instances, though brief, were enough to plant seeds of doubt that eventually sprouted into a full-blown crisis of trust. I remember one particular night when I tried to broach the subject gently, asking her if there was anything she needed to share, anything that might be weighing on her heart. Instead of an honest conversation, I was met with a defensive shrug and a hurried change of subject that left me feeling more isolated than before. The woman I married, the enchanting, confident, and seemingly flawless Sarah, was gradually being replaced by a stranger who evaded intimate conversation about her true self. I began to feel like an outsider in a life that I had once believed was ours to share. The transformation was not marked by dramatic confrontations or explosive arguments, but rather by a slow erosion of trust and the accumulation of subtle, damning inconsistencies. Each revelation, each suppressed detail, chipped away at the foundation of our love until what remained was a hollow shell of a relationship built on half-truths and carefully guarded secrets. In the quiet recesses of my mind, I wrestled with conflicting emotions, anger, betrayal, and an overwhelming sadness at the realization that I had been living with someone who was not truly the person I thought I loved. I was forced to confront the possibility that the magic of our early days was nothing more than an illusion, a carefully constructed performance designed to keep me in the dark. And as I grappled with this painful truth, I couldn't help but wonder how many other aspects of our life together had been built on lies. With each passing day, the gap between the woman I married and the stranger she had become widened until it was a chasm filled with secrets too heavy to bear. Now, as I reflect on those years, I am left with a bitter understanding that trust, once shattered, is nearly impossible to rebuild. I recall the laughter we once shared, now echoing in my memory as a poignant reminder of a time when I believed in love without reservation. Yet, even in the depths of my sorrow, I recognize that the journey through this maze of deception has transformed me, sharpening my resolve and compelling me to seek out the truth, no matter how painful it might be. The interactive dialogue of our shared past continues in my mind, a constant internal conversation where every memory is scrutinized, every word re-examined, and every smile questioned. In this relentless pursuit of understanding, I have come to see that sometimes the most profound betrayals come not from a single act, but from the slow and insidious unraveling of a life built on secrets and half-truths. It was a crisp, overcast morning when I received the call that sent a chill through my veins, an unexpected interruption to my already turbulent thoughts. I had just settled into my routine, the events of recent weeks still swirling in my mind like fragments of a broken mirror. I answered my phone with a hesitant, "Hello?" not expecting anything more than the usual business chatter. But then a familiar voice spoke, one I recognized from the halls of my company, laden with a cautious urgency that immediately set my nerves on edge. "Hey man, your wife's name is Sarah, right? Worked in finance?" he asked, his tone measured but edged with something unspoken. I responded with a guarded, "Yeah, why?" As I felt my heartbeat quicken, the question echoing ominously in the silence that followed. There was a pause, a pregnant silence thick with implications, before he finally uttered the words that would shatter the last remnants of my carefully constructed reality. "There's a woman in Seattle. Same story, same face, same scam." I sat there, frozen in disbelief as the words reverberated in my mind. The mention of Seattle struck me like a bolt of lightning, illuminating a dark corner of suspicion that I had been quietly nurturing for months. My thoughts raced, merging the past and present into a single, overwhelming moment of clarity. The voice on the phone wasn't offering gossip or idle chatter. It was delivering a confirmation of a fear that I had long buried under layers of denial and self-deception. "Laura Hastings," I muttered under my breath, recalling the name that had surfaced during my late-night research into the inconsistencies of our finances and her evasive behavior. The realization hit me hard. The same Laura Hastings, with a background identical to the woman I had known. The same charming smile that had once lit up our shared dreams, but now wearing a different name as if it were a disguise, a mask meant to conceal a hidden life. In that moment, I found myself at a crossroads. The idea that this was not merely an extramarital affair, but a well-practiced pattern of deception, was as unsettling as it was infuriating. The phone call became a catalyst, forcing me to confront the painstaking trail of red flags I had so reluctantly ignored. I pressed for more details, my voice steady despite the storm of emotions inside me, asking him to elaborate on what he had heard, who had been involved, and what he believed the implications were. He hesitated, as if uncertain of how much he should reveal, but eventually mentioned that the details were sketchy. A woman with the same meticulously curated background, the same penchant for secrecy, and a penchant for leaving a trail of financial havoc behind her. The more he spoke, the more I pieced together the fragments of a puzzle that had been forming in my mind over the past few months. As I ended the call, I felt the weight of 100 unspoken questions pressing upon me. I stood by my window, watching the steady drizzle outside, each raindrop reflecting a fragment of the unraveling truth. The memories of our life together, late nights spent poring over bank statements, her subtle evasions, the erratic patterns in her behavior, came rushing back. In the dim light of that moment, everything I had once believed about Sarah was being called into question. The idea that she had been playing me, that her affections and our shared dreams were part of an elaborate scheme, was almost too much to bear. Yet, the evidence was mounting in my mind, a silent chorus of whispered warnings that now demanded acknowledgement. I couldn't shake the feeling that this wasn't an isolated case of infidelity, but rather a meticulously rehearsed routine. A scam, if you will, where the stakes were not merely personal but financial, touching the lives of unsuspecting victims far beyond the confines of our home. The notion that the same woman might be operating under multiple identities, duping several people with the same charm and deceit, ignited a cold fury in me. I thought back to the warnings I had received, the subtle signs that had seemed so insignificant at the time, but now coalesced into an unmistakable pattern of betrayal. How could she orchestrate such a dual life, weaving lies so seamlessly that even the closest observer would be none the wiser? And more importantly, how many others had already fallen prey to her con? The call left me with a decision to make. I could either spiral further into the depths of despair or harness the clarity that this revelation had forced upon me. I chose the latter, steeling myself to act with a cold, calculated determination. I began to review every scrap of evidence I had meticulously gathered, the altered bank statements, the suspicious transaction logs, and the countless moments of her inexplicable behavior. Now, every detail was imbued with a deeper significance, each anomaly a testament to the intricate web of deceit that had ensnared not just me, but potentially many others. In that silent reverie, I resolved to dig deeper into this mystery, to trace every breadcrumb left behind by the woman who had masqueraded as my wife while simultaneously living another life in Seattle. The idea that she had not only betrayed my trust, but had also extended her deceit to others filled me with a grim sense of responsibility. I felt compelled to expose the truth, not merely as an act of personal vindication, but as a necessary measure to prevent further harm to those who might unwittingly become entangled in her scams. As I began planning my next steps, my mind raced with possibilities, each one a challenge to the life I had once known. I realized that the path ahead would be fraught with both emotional turmoil and legal complexities, but I also recognized that I meticulously recorded every unusual withdrawal, every inexplicable expense that did not fit our well-worn pattern. It was like assembling a puzzle, piece by piece, until the picture of betrayal became undeniable. I felt both the weight of heartbreak and the adrenaline of a man on the hunt, every keystroke and line of data reinforcing the truth that she had carefully orchestrated this elaborate con. In those quiet hours, as I scrolled through months of financial records, my mind drifted back to the moments when I had first sensed that something was amiss. I recalled the nights when I had seen her lock her phone with a precision that hinted at secrets too important to share. I remembered her sudden, inexplicable interest in monitoring our joint finances, a task that had always been solely my responsibility, and the hurried glances she cast whenever I attempted to discuss our future together. Each memory, each tiny detail that had once seemed inconsequential, now served as a signpost pointing toward the inevitable betrayal. I couldn't help but marvel at the meticulous care with which she had hidden her true self, and it was this very precision that gave me the confidence to play along while I built my own case. There was a strange irony in the way I felt. Even as a storm of betrayal and grief raged within me, a calm determination took root. I had learned long ago that to truly understand an adversary, one must observe their every move, anticipate their next step, and even mirror their actions if necessary. So, I began to act as if nothing were wrong, continuing our routine, maintaining the semblance of normalcy that I hoped would lull her into a false sense of security. I would ask casual questions about her day, casually mention the bank statements, and watch her reactions with a clinical detachment that belied the tumultuous emotions churning beneath the surface. Every smile, every flicker of hesitation in her eyes, was noted and filed away in the growing archive of evidence that I was assembling. I wasn't simply gathering data. I was constructing a narrative that would expose the full extent of her betrayal. I tracked every transaction and cross-referenced it with her excuses. I made copies of every document that seemed out of place, every receipt that didn't match the story she had told me. Slowly, a map of her secret life began to emerge, each detail a waypoint on the route to the truth. There were moments when I doubted myself, wondering if I was reading too much into mundane occurrences, but the consistency of the discrepancies soon silenced any lingering doubts. I reminded myself that in matters of the heart, the smallest details can often reveal the deepest lies. I took a bold step further, one that I knew would be a turning point in this twisted game. With the evidence mounting and my mind reeling from the implications of her double life, I decided to secure my own assets. I locked down my accounts, transferring funds into secure channels that she would have no access to. It was a necessary act of self-preservation, a move to ensure that I would not be left destitute by the very person I once loved. I felt a surge of satisfaction mixed with sorrow as I watched the transactions go through, each one a nail in the coffin of our shared financial life. This was not an act of revenge, I told myself, but rather a rational measure to safeguard what remained of my dignity and security. Even as I set these plans into motion, I remained acutely aware of the delicate balance I had to maintain. I couldn't let her suspect that I was onto her. That knowledge would only prompt her to accelerate her escape or tighten her grip on the lies she had so carefully spun. Instead, I continued to play the part of the unsuspecting husband, a role I had perfected over the years. I engaged in conversation with a veneer of casual normalcy, all the while recording every syllable, every micro-expression that might later serve as a testament to her guilt. I became a student of her behavior, decoding her responses as if they were clues in a mystery novel, each one leading me closer to the truth.
It was a dangerous game, one where a single misstep could tip her off, but the stakes were too high to risk inaction. Night after night, I reviewed my notes, cross-referenced phone records, and even began to map out timelines of her supposed work trips against my own calendar. I constructed a dossier so thorough that even the most meticulous investigator would have been impressed. In the silent hours before dawn, I would sometimes catch myself murmuring the details aloud, as if by speaking the evidence I could cement the truth in my mind. I was preparing for the inevitable confrontation, a moment when all the pieces of her elaborate charade would be laid bare, and she would have nowhere to hide. Every moment of preparation was a step toward reclaiming control of a life that had been hijacked by deceit. And so, in the quiet solitude of my study, surrounded by documents and data that painted an unflinching portrait of betrayal, I felt both the agony of loss and the hard-won determination of a man who refused to be played. I knew that soon, the time would come when she would have to answer for every lie, every stolen moment, and every piece of my trust that she had shattered. I was ready. I was prepared for the inevitable, and as the night deepened, so too did my resolve. The game was on, and I had already taken the first decisive steps toward uncovering the full truth of her double life. The phone rang at an odd hour that evening, a call that cut through the lingering silence of my self-imposed isolation and jolted me from the steady hum of my preparations. I'd been piecing together every fragment of evidence, every slip-up that Sarah had so meticulously concealed, when the shrill sound of the ringtone pierced the calm. I glanced at the screen and saw a number I didn't immediately recognize. For a moment, I hesitated, wondering if it was another of her cleverly orchestrated distractions. But then the caller ID flickered with a familiar name, Rachel. My heart pounded in my chest as I answered, "Hello?" Her voice, usually so measured and playful, came through in a frantic, disjointed rush. "It's me, Rachel. I'm so sorry to call like this, but you have to listen. She's done it again, she's drained my account. There was a quiver of panic woven into every syllable, and I could hear a hint of desperation in her tone. I pressed for details, my mind racing through the implications of her words. Rachel, slow down. What do you mean, drained your account? I asked, trying to keep my voice even, though internally I felt the pressure of confirmation tightening around me like a vice. I trusted her, you know, she choked out, each word laced with both betrayal and fear. The money she borrowed from me, it's all gone. I went to check my account this morning, and it's like she just vanished with everything. I don't know what to do. You need to help me, please. Her words hit me like a thunderbolt. It wasn't just me she had deceived. The realization that Sarah's web of lies extended beyond our own fractured marriage to include unsuspecting friends and perhaps even colleagues struck me with a cold, unyielding finality. I felt a surge of anger mixed with a deep, painful resignation. Rachel, listen to me, I said, my voice firm and resolute, though each word was laced with a sorrow I hadn't anticipated feeling again. I'm already on it. I know what she's been doing. She's not just stealing from me, she's stealing from everyone she touches. In that moment, the weight of the betrayal transformed from a solitary burden into a shared nightmare, one that now involved more lives than just my own. It was as if the tapestry of deception was woven with threads of greed and malice, spreading far beyond the confines of our shattered trust. I listened as Rachel's ragged breathing filled the silence on the other end of the line, punctuating her confession of financial ruin. Her panic was contagious, yet in its urgency, it also galvanized me further. I reassured her, Rachel, I promise you, I won't let her get away with this. I've been collecting every bit of evidence, every detail of her scheme. Now that I know how many people she's affected, it's time to bring everything to light. Her voice wavered between hope and despair, and I could almost see her through the static, a woman betrayed, left to pick up the pieces of her shattered trust. The conversation took on the weight of a mission. Each detail Rachel provided, the unauthorized transfers, the hurried explanations, the unsettling silences when questioned, only reinforced the damning picture I had been constructing for months. I began to ask pointed questions, probing for every piece of information that could further solidify the case against her. When did you first notice something was wrong? How did she convince you to let her handle the funds? I inquired gently, my mind cataloging her every response like data points in a grim equation. She recounted moments of charm and manipulation, times when her careful words and reassuring smiles had masked a darker intent. Every story she told was a mirror reflecting the patterns I had seen in my own life, a facade of love and reliability that hid a meticulously calculated fraud. As the minutes stretched into what felt like an eternity, I began to outline the next steps in my mind. I reassured her that I would contact the authorities, that her story was not just an isolated incident but part of a larger pattern of deceit that had ensnared too many innocent people. Rachel, I'm going to compile everything we have, your records, my records, every piece of evidence, and I'll pass it on to the FBI. You're not alone in this, and we're going to make sure she pays for what she's done. My words carried a promise, one born out of the deepest parts of my resolve, a promise to transform my personal betrayal into a crusade for justice. Rachel's voice softened, and I could sense a flicker of relief through the static. Thank you, she whispered, the gravity of her situation mingling with gratitude. I was so scared, I thought I'd lost everything. I reminded her firmly that while the pain of betrayal was undeniable, it could also be the catalyst for a reckoning that would prevent further harm. I understand the fear, but remember, fear can be a powerful motivator for change. Today, we fight back. Today, we take control. In that instant, our conversation shifted from one of personal grief to a shared determination to expose a fraudster who had played on trust and exploited vulnerabilities. After we ended the call, I sat back in my chair, the phone still warm from the call, a tangible reminder that Sarah's lies had left a trail of devastation far beyond our own lives. My mind raced with the enormity of the situation. She had not only dismantled the trust between us, but had also cast a dark shadow over the lives of those who had believed in her. And now, with Rachel's desperate plea echoing in my ears, I knew there was no turning back. The stakes had escalated beyond personal revenge. This was about protecting innocent people from further harm. That call from Rachel was the turning point, a moment when the scattered pieces of betrayal coalesced into a stark, undeniable truth. Sarah's deception was not isolated, and she had been orchestrating a grand scheme to defraud not just me, but everyone in her wake. In that moment, I felt a mixture of sorrow, anger, and a fierce determination to see justice done. I resolved that no matter how deep the web of lies, I would unravel it thread by thread. The call had changed everything. It was no longer just about my shattered trust or the financial ruins left behind, it was about reclaiming the truth, not only for me but for every victim she had ensnared. With a heavy heart yet a resolute spirit, I began planning the next steps. I would contact the authorities, collate every shred of evidence, and ensure that the extent of her deception would be laid bare for all to see. And as I set about this daunting task, I could only hope that, in the end, the call that changed everything would be the catalyst for a long overdue reckoning, a reckoning that would see her finally held accountable for the pain and betrayal she had inflicted on so many. I had reached a point where I couldn't simply sit on the evidence any longer. Every piece of documentation, every bank statement, and every whispered detail from Rachel had painted an increasingly damning portrait of Sarah's duplicity. That realization spurred me to reach out to a private investigator, a man with a reputation for methodical work and discretion, and, over the course of several tense days, we unearthed the shocking extent of her web of deceit. I recall the day vividly. I was in my study, the quiet hum of the computer and the weight of the evidence pressed down on me, when the investigator, a seasoned professional with a calm yet inquisitive demeanor, began presenting his findings. His voice was low and measured as he explained that Sarah wasn't merely living a double life, she was a serial con artist. He laid out a timeline that was as damning as it was meticulously detailed. According to his research, she had been married 3 times before, each marriage ending under similarly suspicious circumstances, and there were 2 ongoing fraud investigations that pointed to her cunning manipulation of finances across multiple states. I listened in stunned silence as he revealed that one of her previous spouses had vanished without a trace, leaving behind a trail of ruined lives and emptied bank accounts. It became clear that Sarah had been more than just a cheat in our marriage. She was a career criminal who had honed her skills over the years with chilling precision. Just as I was grappling with this new, frightening reality, my phone rang. The caller ID displayed an unfamiliar number, but something about the tone on the other end made it unmistakably authoritative. When I answered, a calm, assertive voice introduced himself as an FBI agent. "Mr. Thompson, do you know where your wife is?" he asked, and I could sense a mixture of professionalism and urgency in his tone. I hesitated only for a moment before replying with the resolve that had come to define my every action since the day I found that fateful note on our refrigerator. "No, I don't," I said, my voice steady despite the tumult raging inside me. "But I have a pretty good idea of where she's trying to run." The agent paused, and I could almost see him processing every word, every nuance of my response. "We've been tracking her activities for some time now," he explained. "Your case has provided us with critical insights into a much larger network of fraud. We're in the process of coordinating with local authorities in multiple states. Your cooperation is paramount." I listened intently, my mind racing with the implications of his words. Here was the confirmation that Sarah wasn't just a personal betrayal, she was a wanted criminal whose actions had affected countless lives. As the call continued, the agent outlined the steps they had taken and what I could expect moving forward. I felt an odd mix of vindication and sorrow, a grim satisfaction that the scales of justice were finally beginning to tip in my favor, even as the painful truth of our shared past threatened to overwhelm me. Every detail he provided, every reference to cases and investigations, underscored the magnitude of the deception I had unwittingly been a part of. I realized that my personal pursuit of the truth was now interwoven with a larger mission, to bring a dangerous con artist to justice and to protect future victims from her meticulously crafted schemes. After the call ended, I sat back in my chair and let the gravity of the moment sink in. The realization that Sarah had manipulated not only me but also numerous others with the same artful blend of charm and cunning was a bitter pill to swallow. I thought of all the lives ruined by her lies, the abandoned spouses, the bewildered victims of financial scams, and the quiet, desperate calls from people like Rachel who had trusted her. The evidence was now irrefutable, a tapestry of deceit woven with threads of fraud and broken promises. I could picture the investigators poring over documents, connecting dots that had once seemed disparate and isolated, and I felt a strange sense of relief that the burden of ignorance was finally lifting. Yet, even as I embraced this newfound clarity, I couldn't help but reflect on the personal cost of her betrayal. Every lie, every carefully curated illusion of love and reliability, had led me down a path I never imagined I would traverse. I had seen the woman I loved turn into a master manipulator, orchestrating a scam that spanned multiple lives and generations of deceit. And now, with the FBI actively pursuing her, I felt both the sting of loss and the resolute satisfaction of being on the right side of justice. The investigator had provided me with copies of incriminating documents, bank statements with suspicious entries, and even testimonials from previous victims. Each piece was a reminder that Sarah had been leading a double, or rather, multiple, life for years. In that moment, I resolved to help the authorities in any way I could, not only to reclaim what was rightfully mine but to ensure that no one else would fall prey to her sophisticated deceptions. The call from the FBI marked a turning point, a moment when personal tragedy intersected with a broader pursuit of justice. I knew that the road ahead would be fraught with legal battles, painful confrontations, and a final reckoning for a woman who had mastered the art of the scam. But as I gathered the evidence that would soon be my testimony, I felt a clarity and purpose that transcended the anguish of our shattered relationship. I was no longer just a victim of betrayal, I was now a key witness in a case that would expose a con artist's legacy of fraud. And in that realization, I found a glimmer of hope, a hope that, in the end, truth and justice would prevail over lies and deceit, and that the biggest mistake of her life would be coming to fruition as she finally faced the consequences of her actions. Tuesday came like a culmination of every silent preparation and calculated move I had made over the past few weeks, a day that would finally force Sarah to face the consequences of her deception. The day started quietly enough, with the usual hum of routine and the background clatter of my thoughts running through every piece of evidence I had so meticulously gathered. Then, as if on cue, a message pinged on my phone, a simple, almost casual text that read, "Hey, baby. I made a mistake. Can we talk?" In that moment, my heart skipped, not out of love or longing, but because I recognized it as the trigger I had been waiting for. I took a steady breath and responded affirmatively, agreeing to meet her that very day at a secluded cafe, a place we had chosen in the past for private conversations that now held a different kind of gravity. I arrived early, every sense heightened and alert as I took my usual seat in a quiet corner, where I could see the entrance and monitor every movement. The soft murmur of other patrons, the clink of porcelain cups, and the distant murmur of city life were all background noise compared to the pounding of my heart and the relentless ticking of time that brought me closer to our confrontation. I mentally rehearsed the role I had prepared for, a husband who appeared calm, empathetic, and unsuspecting, a facade to lull her into a false sense of security. I reminded myself that every word, every pause, every slight tremor in my voice was to be measured and controlled. I was not only meeting her, I was setting a trap, one that would ensure that every lie she had spun would be laid bare before the authorities. When she finally walked in, I noted how her expression was a conflicted mix of remorse and fear, her eyes downcast and her hands clutched together as if trying to hold herself together. She approached hesitantly, and for a moment, the person I once loved seemed to flicker behind the mask of deceit. But I had learned not to be swayed by a fleeting display of vulnerability. I greeted her with a measured smile, inviting her to sit across from me as though nothing out of the ordinary was unfolding. "Sarah, where have you been?" I asked softly, letting the question hang in the air as I studied her reaction. Her hands trembled noticeably, a subtle but unmistakable sign that the facade was beginning to crumble. She opened her mouth to speak, and I could almost hear the practiced quiver of fabricated regret in her voice as she mumbled, I was scared. I needed time. Can we just talk?" I nodded, feigning understanding, while inside my mind was racing through every detail of the trap I had set. My heart was not swayed by the soft tone of her excuses. Instead, it hardened with the resolve that had grown over months of uncovering her web of lies. I reached beneath the table and produced a thick folder, its contents a veritable dossier of her entire con history, a collection of bank statements, emails, and witness testimonies that detailed every fraudulent move she had made. I slid the folder across the table towards her, my gesture deliberate and final. "Right after you explain this," I said evenly, my voice carrying the weight of years of betrayal. Her eyes widened as she glanced down at the folder. I saw a flicker of shock and panic, a momentary loss of composure that betrayed her inner turmoil. But before she could even begin to speak, the sound of approaching footsteps and the sudden appearance of several stern-faced individuals in dark suits shattered the fragile illusion of normalcy. In a perfectly orchestrated moment that I had anticipated with chilling clarity, FBI agents moved in, surrounding our table with a precision that left no room for escape. The cafe fell into a hushed silence as reality crashed in. The woman who had deceived me, who had stolen not just my trust but also the trust of countless others, was finally ensnared by the trap I had set. "Sarah Thompson, you're under arrest," one of the agents declared firmly, his voice carrying the authority of the law. I watched as her face turned ashen, the color draining from her features in an instant. For a moment, I was struck by the stark contrast between the woman I had once believed in and the cold, calculating con artist who now stared back at me, defeated and exposed. I felt no surge of vindictive glee, only a profound sense of closure, a realization that the long, arduous journey of piecing together her lies had led to this inevitable moment of reckoning. In that charged silence, my mind raced back to every small detail I had noted, every hidden transaction and every whispered conversation with other victims, all culminating in this final act of justice. As the agents led her away, I remained seated, still clutching the folder like a tangible symbol of the truth. The weight of the evidence was heavy in my hands, a reminder that the cost of deception had been far greater than the loss of trust. It had disrupted lives and spread misery to those who had placed their faith in her charm. I knew that my role in this ordeal was not solely one of personal retribution. I had become a critical part of a larger effort to stop a criminal whose trail of lies had ensnared too many unsuspecting souls.
In the aftermath, as the murmurs in the cafe resumed and the agents began to ask me questions, I maintained my calm, answering each query with measured precision. I realized that every moment of this encounter was interactive, a dialogue not only between me and Sarah but also with the justice system that had been waiting for this opportunity. I had set the trap with unwavering focus and now watched as the consequences of her actions were laid bare. There was no turning back, no undoing the choices that had led us to this moment, but there was also a sense of liberation in finally reclaiming control. In that silent, tense atmosphere, I felt the weight of my past lift ever so slightly, replaced by the resolute clarity that truth, however painful, was the only path forward. As I left the cafe later that day, the dossier safely in the hands of the authorities and the reality of her arrest etched indelibly in my mind, I knew that this was not merely the end of our marriage but the beginning of a new chapter. A chapter defined by accountability, justice, and the hard-won lesson that no amount of charm can hide the truth forever. Sitting in the courtroom that day, I felt the heavy burden of months of pain and betrayal finally coming to a head, as if every sleepless night and every calculated move had led me to this moment of brutal reckoning. The atmosphere was thick with tension, the air punctuated by the low murmur of the gathered crowd and the occasional shuffling of feet as witnesses took their places. I had spent the last several weeks meticulously gathering evidence, revisiting every moment of deception, and today, all of that was about to be laid bare for the judge, the jury, and everyone who had once placed their trust in her. As the proceedings began, I watched Sarah, no, Laura Hastings, as she had been revealed to be, take the stand, her eyes darting around the room as if seeking a way to escape the inevitable truth. She pleaded, her voice cracking with contrived remorse, as if the audience might be swayed by her performance of vulnerability. But I knew better than to be fooled by her theatrics. Every tear that fell seemed rehearsed, every quiver in her tone a calculated effort to manipulate the sympathy of those who were present. Yet I remained impassive, my mind locked on the facts that had been painstakingly assembled over months of investigation. The evidence, undeniable in its clarity, detailed every instance of wire fraud, identity theft, and grand larceny that she had committed, each piece a stark reminder of the deceit that had shattered not only our marriage but the lives of countless unsuspecting victims. As the prosecutor presented the damning financial records, transaction logs, and testimonials from other victims, I felt a surge of vindication tempered by a deep, lingering sadness, knowing that every line item in those statements represented trust so callously betrayed. I found myself interacting silently with the evidence, recalling each moment when I had felt a flicker of doubt, each small anomaly that now coalesced into a comprehensive picture of her criminal enterprise. The judge, a man whose steady gaze seemed to pierce through the layers of lies, listened intently as the evidence was laid out like a roadmap to her downfall. I could see the determination in his eyes as he reviewed the documents that I had spent countless hours compiling, a silent confirmation that justice, however delayed, would finally be served. When it came time for Sarah to speak in her own defense, her voice rose in a torrent of accusations and manipulated grief, claiming that I had been responsible for the collapse of our marriage, that I had somehow driven her to desperate measures. Her words, meant to turn the tables and paint herself as the victim, fell flat against the unyielding mountain of evidence that had been presented. I sat there, heart pounding, listening to her futile attempts to rewrite the narrative, and felt a cold, resolute satisfaction in knowing that the truth was now irrefutable. The courtroom was a stage for this final betrayal, a reckoning that would strip away all pretense and reveal the depths of her deception. As the trial progressed, the weight of every manipulated account and every stolen dollar was borne out in the somber silence that settled over the room with each new piece of incontrovertible evidence. I found myself locked in a silent dialogue with the past, every memory of whispered lies and hushed warnings now echoing in the space between me and her. Finally, the judge, his voice measured and unyielding, addressed Sarah directly, his eyes locking onto hers in a final, piercing moment of accountability. Sarah Thompson, or should I say, Laura Hastings, you are sentenced to 20 years in federal prison, he declared, each word ringing out as a decree that shattered any remnants of her carefully cultivated persona. The courtroom erupted in a subdued murmur, a mixture of relief and somber justice that reverberated through the room. In that moment, as her eyes met mine, I saw a flash of panic and raw, unadulterated fury. She turned toward me, her voice trembling with a desperate accusation. "You did this to me," she cried, a mixture of disbelief and venom lacing her tone. For a fleeting second, time seemed to pause, and in that charged silence, I felt every ounce of betrayal and every broken promise converge into one immutable truth. I managed a small, knowing smile, a gesture not of triumph over her, but of acknowledgement that her own actions had sealed her fate. "No, sweetheart," I replied coolly, my voice carrying the weight of every moment that had led to this day. "You did this to yourself." My words hung in the air, a final, irrevocable pronouncement that closed the chapter on the life she had constructed out of lies. In that instant, I felt a sense of closure, as if the final betrayal had been met with an equally final reckoning. And I knew that though the scars of her deception would remain with me for a long time, they would also serve as a testament to my resilience. As the gavel came down, marking the end of the trial, I stepped out of that courtroom into a world that would forever be changed by the unmasking of a con artist. I was not the same man who had once believed in the power of love and trust without caution. I had been forged in the crucible of betrayal and emerged with a hardened resolve to never allow such deceit to pass unchallenged again. The final betrayal had been rendered moot by the unyielding pursuit of justice, and as I walked away, I carried with me the knowledge that sometimes the most painful lessons are the ones that pave the way for a future defined not by sorrow, but by the strength to move forward and rebuild a life founded on truth. 6 months had passed since that fateful day when Sarah's carefully constructed world of deceit crumbled before my eyes, and today, I found myself standing at the podium of a small conference room, preparing to deliver a lecture on fraud prevention. I remember the way my hands trembled ever so slightly as I adjusted the microphone, the weight of my past still pressing on my shoulders, yet tempered by a newfound resolve that had grown from the embers of betrayal. The room was filled with attentive faces, colleagues, industry professionals, and even a few former victims who had gathered to learn from my experience, each person representing a chance to prevent another life from being shattered by the kind of manipulation that had once upended my own. I took a deep breath, feeling the steady rhythm of my heartbeat as I began to speak, not as a broken man clinging to remnants of lost love, but as someone who had transformed his pain into a beacon for truth and accountability. I started by recounting the early days when I first sensed that something was amiss, a subtle shift in behavior, an inexplicable change in the way Sarah guarded details that once seemed trivial. I invited the audience to reflect on their own experiences, asking, "Have you ever felt that nagging doubt, that small whisper of suspicion that perhaps things aren't as they seem?" The question hung in the air, interactive and engaging, drawing nods and murmurs of agreement. As I shared my story, of cold sheets on a lonely morning, a hastily scrawled note on the fridge, and the slow, painful process of uncovering a vast network of fraud, I watched as the room transformed into a collective space of understanding and vigilance. I explained how each small detail, once dismissed as an innocent anomaly, eventually aligned to form a pattern too consistent to ignore. It was a lesson not just in financial prudence, but in the art of truly listening to one's intuition. As I spoke, I could see the intensity in the eyes of those listening, the same determination that had once driven me to meticulously compile evidence and secure my accounts. I described how I had transformed that initial shock into a systematic plan, playing along with Sarah's facade while secretly gathering every bit of incriminating proof. I recalled the moments when I had felt both the bitter sting of betrayal and the cold satisfaction of knowing that each piece of data brought me closer to justice. I encouraged my audience to never underestimate the power of preparation, of safeguarding not only their finances but also their sense of self-worth. I reminded them that the best revenge is not in revenge at all, but in the ability to move on, to rebuild a life that is richer in experience and fortified against future deception. I paused, inviting questions, and one of the attendees asked, "How did you find the strength to transform your pain into action?" The question resonated deeply with me, and I replied, "I realized that every lie, every manipulated detail, was not just a personal wound. It was a call to protect others from suffering the same fate." That moment of connection sparked a shift in the atmosphere. It was as if the room collectively exhaled the tension of shared trauma, and in its place, a sense of empowerment began to settle. I described the long nights poring over bank statements, the silent determination that grew as I pieced together a dossier that would eventually help bring Sarah to justice. I detailed the bittersweet satisfaction of hearing the fraud alerts ring on Monday morning, the digital confirmation that her own trap was working against her. But more than that, I explained that the true victory lay not in the arrest or the courtroom drama, but in reclaiming control over my own life, transforming a personal tragedy into a mission for the greater good. Throughout my lecture, I emphasized that while Sarah's deception had been devastating, it had also been a catalyst for my transformation. I had come to understand that the best revenge was not in seeking further retribution, but in living a life where such betrayal could no longer hold sway. I recounted the final days of the trial, the moment when her facade crumbled completely in front of a judge's gavel, and how I had found closure not in bitterness, but in the affirmation that truth, however painful, would always prevail. I urged everyone to remain vigilant, to question the status quo, and to never let their guard down, even in the most trusted of relationships. I concluded by sharing my current outlook, a life built on the hard-earned lessons of trust and deception, one where every scar served as a reminder of resilience rather than a mark of defeat. I explained that moving on did not mean forgetting the past, but rather learning from it, using the pain as a stepping stone toward a future defined by strength, wisdom, and unwavering self-respect. As I stepped away from the podium, the room erupted in thoughtful applause, not just for the story of a con artist brought to justice, but for the testament of a man who had risen above his suffering to forge a path of empowerment for himself and others. In that moment, I realized that the best revenge was indeed moving on, transforming the ruins of a broken past into a foundation for a brighter, more secure future. Every word spoken that day resonated with the power of resilience, and as I mingled with the attendees afterward, I knew that the legacy of my journey would extend far beyond the courtroom and the personal trials it entailed. It would live on in the lives of those who learned to guard their hearts and their finances, who understood that vigilance and self-respect were the true antidotes to betrayal. And that, I thought, was the ultimate victory. A triumph not measured in years behind bars, but in the reclaiming of life itself.